For most of human history, midnight did not exist the way we understand it. There was no glowing clock on the wall, telling a farmer that 12 hours had passed since morning. There was no streetlight outside the window, no illuminated road stretching toward the horizon, no blue screen keeping the room awake long after the sun had disappeared.
For thousands of years, the night was governed by something far simpler and far more absolute. The sun went down, the light disappeared, and the human world slowly surrendered itself to darkness. That changed the way people experienced the end of the day. When the sun dropped below the horizon in an ancient settlement, darkness did not arrive as a gradual inconvenience. It erased the landscape. Roads disappeared, fields vanished, familiar buildings became silhouettes. On a moonless night, a person standing only a short distance from a fire could lose sight of almost everything beyond its reach. The world became smaller with every passing minute, until the household itself was the brightest and safest thing left in existence. And that small circle of light mattered.
An ancient oil lamp was not a modern lamp in miniature. It was usually a simple vessel of clay, stone, or bronze, holding a small pool of oil, with a wick resting in a narrow spout. The flame was weak, compared with even the cheapest light we use today. It did not fill an entire room with brightness.
It illuminated a face, a hand, a bowl, perhaps a few objects nearby, while the walls beyond it dissolved into moving shadow. A single flame could make a room habitable, but it could never make the night disappear. That distinction shaped the ancient evening. When the light outside failed, people did not simply replace it with something brighter. They adjusted themselves to the darkness. Work slowed, movement decreased, families gathered closer together, the animals were settled, food was prepared, doors were secured, the fire was watched carefully. Eventually, the practical business of the day gave way to the quieter business of being alive at night. This was the hour history usually forgets. We remember ancient people when they were doing extraordinary things. We remember the Egyptian builders raising monuments along the Nile, Roman armies crossing continents, Greek thinkers debating beneath the Mediterranean sun, Babylonian priests studying the heavens, kings issuing commands from their palaces. But none of those people spent their entire lives performing great acts. Every one of them eventually became tired. Every one of them eventually returned home, or to a barracks, a family room, a rooftop, a simple sleeping space, and faced the same basic human problem. How do you become calm enough to sleep? The question was more serious than it sounds. Sleep meant surrender. For several hours, a person could no longer watch the doorway, tend the fire, guard possessions, or respond immediately to danger. The sleeper became physically helpless. In a world where darkness concealed thieves, predators, unfamiliar travelers, and countless things that people believed moved beyond ordinary human sight, that vulnerability carried real emotional weight. The ancient night was therefore both frightening and strangely comforting. Outside the household was the unknown. Inside was warmth, familiar voices, and the small trembling glow of a flame. The darkness pushed people inward. The scattered activities of daylight contracted into one room, one fire, one meal, and one group of people sharing the same night. That communal quality is easy to miss when we imagine ancient sleep through modern eyes. Today, the end of the day can be remarkably individual. One person watches television while another scrolls through a phone. Someone else works late beneath an electric lamp. A bedroom can remain bright long after midnight, and the outside world continues moving, regardless of whether we are ready for sleep. Ancient people lived under a different rhythm. The evening naturally became darker. The available light became weaker. The body became tired. and the world offered fewer reasons to remain awake. This did not mean ancient people were always peaceful sleepers. They had nightmares, grief, illness, anxiety, family troubles, hunger, fear, and restless nights just as we do. Their lives were not some perfect pastoral dream. In many ways, their nights were harder than ours. Cold could be dangerous. Fire could destroy a home. Illness could become frighteningly serious. A bad harvest could remain in a person's thoughts, even after the day's work was finished. But they developed ways of dealing with that uncertainty. Some were practical, some were social, some were religious, and some were almost instinctive. They ate together at the end of the day. They talked. They listened to stories. They sang to children. They prayed for protection. They used fragrance, warmth, familiar objects, and repeated rituals to make the transition from waking life into sleep less abrupt. The details differed enormously from one civilization to another. In Egypt, some people slept on flat rooftops during warm nights, beneath a sky filled with stars, while distinctive curved headrests supported the head and were sometimes decorated with protective figures. Elsewhere, families gathered around hearths and lamps, using the limited light not only to see, but to create a small boundary between themselves and the darkness beyond the walls. These were not random habits. They were ways of making the night understandable and manageable. And that may be the most important thing to understand about ancient sleep. People did not simply go from work to unconsciousness. They crossed a threshold. The evening meal marked one stage of that crossing. The fading light marked another. Conversation, stories, prayer, scent, and the quiet preparation of the sleeping place carried the mind farther away from the demands of the day. The night had its own sequence. First came the disappearance of daylight. Then came the gathering. Then the small flame. Then food. Then voices. Then silence. And eventually, sleep. But before any of those rituals could truly begin, there was one problem every ancient household had to solve: the darkness itself. Because once the sun had vanished, the human world depended on a remarkably fragile technology to remain awake, a tiny flame fed by oil, held inside a small vessel, burning against a darkness that stretched far beyond the walls. That flame was more than a source of light. It determined how long the evening could last. It shaped what people could do after sunset. It created warmth and companionship. It pushed the darkness back, just far enough for faces to remain visible. And when the oil was finally gone, or the fire had been carefully reduced to glowing embers, the household knew something that modern people have almost forgotten how to recognize. The day was finished. There was nothing left to do. The night had won, and the ancient world, for a few precious hours, belonged to the dark. But before the final flame disappeared, there was still one last circle of light around which the household would gather. And that little flame, the lamp, the hearth, the carefully guarded fire, was about to become the center of the entire ancient evening.
To understand how ancient people prepared themselves for sleep, we first have to understand what the night actually meant to them. For us, darkness is mostly an absence of light, something temporary and easily corrected. For an ancient person, darkness could feel almost like a physical presence, something that arrived from beyond the horizon and gradually surrounded the human world until only the small circle of a household remained visible.
The fields disappeared first, then the roads, then the distant houses, until eventually there was nothing beyond the walls or the fire, except an enormous blackness filled with sounds that could no longer be matched to familiar faces. On a moonless night in a small settlement thousands of years ago, the difference between the illuminated world and the darkness beyond it could be astonishing. A person standing near a fire might see the faces of their family clearly, perhaps the outline of a doorway or the rough surface of a wall, but only a few steps away, everything dissolved into shadow. The familiar path that had been obvious in daylight could become uncertain. A tree that had been ordinary in the afternoon could become a strange silhouette. The sounds of animals seemed closer because the darkness concealed their movements, and every unfamiliar noise had to be interpreted without the help of sight. This mattered because ancient people did not think of the night as an empty space. In many cultures, darkness belonged to a different order of existence. It was associated with gods, spirits, ancestors, the dead, dreams, and forces that were believed to become active when ordinary human life had withdrawn indoors. Some of these beliefs were deeply religious, while others were practical responses to genuine danger. A thief really could use the darkness for concealment. A wild animal really could approach a settlement more easily after sunset. A traveler really could lose the road when landmarks disappeared. Even fire, the thing that offered protection from the night, carried its own danger in homes built from wood, reeds, mud, and thatch. So the approach of evening changed the emotional atmosphere of an entire household. During the day, people were spread across fields, workshops, markets, roads, rivers, and courtyards. Everyone had separate tasks and separate movements. But as the light weakened, those scattered lives began to contract toward the same small spaces. The family returned home. Animals were brought closer. Doors were secured. Food was prepared. Tools were put away. The world became smaller, quieter, and more intimate. In this sense, darkness had a strange double character. It could frighten people, but it could also bring them together. The same night that concealed dangers outside also created a protected little world inside. A family sitting beside a fire could hear the wind moving beyond the walls without seeing what was causing it. They could hear animals in the distance, but they could also hear the breathing and voices of the people they trusted. The darkness outside became something that everyone faced together. That shared experience may have been one of the most important differences between ancient sleep and modern sleep. Today, preparing for bed is often a private activity. A person may close the door to a bedroom, pick up a phone, read something, watch something, listen to something, and eventually fall asleep alone. Ancient people, especially those living in ordinary households, were much more likely to sleep near other members of the family or community. The sounds of other people moving, whispering, breathing, and settling down were simply part of the night. There was comfort in that closeness. Imagine lying down after a long day while the fire is still glowing somewhere nearby. You can hear someone shifting beneath a blanket. You can hear a child breathing. Perhaps an older member of the household is still speaking quietly. The door has been secured, the animals have been settled, and the last lamp is burning low. Outside is the darkness, but inside is the familiar sound of human life continuing at a slower pace. The body itself also played an important role in making sleep possible. Ancient life was physically demanding for the majority of people.
Farming required hours of walking, lifting, digging, carrying, harvesting, grinding, and tending animals. Craftsmen worked with their hands and bodies. People carried water, prepared food, repaired buildings, cleaned living spaces, and performed hundreds of small physical tasks that modern technology has removed from daily life.
By the time darkness arrived, many people were not merely mentally tired, their entire bodies had spent the day working. That kind of physical exhaustion could make sleep feel less like something that had to be engineered and more like something that naturally arrived when the work was finished. There were no sleep trackers telling a farmer how many hours remained before morning. There was no glowing clock on the wall reminding someone that they had only 6 hours left. There was simply the gradual recognition that the body had reached the end of its strength and the day had reached the end of its light. Yet physical tiredness did not guarantee peaceful sleep. A tired person could still worry. A mother could still think about a sick child. A farmer could still wonder whether the harvest would survive the coming weather. A traveler could still fear the road ahead. A soldier could still remember the violence of the day. An old person could still lie awake thinking about people they had lost. Human beings did not become emotionally simpler simply because they lived thousands of years ago. And so the evening needed more than exhaustion. It needed a transition. People needed some way to tell themselves that the active part of the day had ended and that the vulnerable hours of darkness could now be endured. They needed familiar actions that happened in roughly the same order, night after night. These rituals did not need to be complicated. In fact, their power often came from their simplicity. A meal, a fire, a story, a prayer, a familiar smell, a particular place to lie down, a few repeated words. The same sequence of small actions could gradually become a signal to the mind that nothing more was expected.
This is one of the quiet themes running through the history of ancient sleep. People did not necessarily understand sleep scientifically, but they understood transition. They knew that the mind could not always move instantly from the pressures of daylight into deep rest.
The evening had to carry them there, and the first stage of that transition was usually light. The ancient world did not have the bright, constant illumination that surrounds us today. Light was precious, limited, and expensive. A small flame could transform a room, but it could never erase the night completely. It created an island of visibility surrounded by darkness, and the boundary between those two worlds remained obvious. The closer the flame burned, the more comforting its warmth and light became. Beyond it, the shadows remained. That may have given ancient evenings a rhythm that is difficult for us to reproduce. As the night deepened, the household did not become brighter in order to continue the day. It became dimmer. The light naturally encouraged people to slow down. Work that required careful vision became increasingly difficult. Conversation became easier than labor. Stories became easier than reading. Sitting became easier than moving. Eventually, there was simply no practical reason to remain awake. The flame itself became a kind of clock. When the oil was running low, people knew the evening was advancing. When the fire had been reduced to embers, the household knew that the day was nearly finished. There was no exact digital time telling everyone that it was 10:47 at night. Instead, the physical world provided its own signals: the darkness outside, the cooling air, the fading flame, the tired body, and the silence of the surrounding settlement. The night, therefore, had boundaries, but they were natural boundaries rather than artificial ones. And once the household had gathered inside that small circle of light, another ancient ritual could begin. Food would be brought forward, conversation would settle into a slower rhythm, and the day's labor would finally give way to the evening meal. For most people, this was not a grand feast. It was something much simpler: bread, grain, vegetables, olives, fruit, cheese, perhaps fish, or a little meat when circumstances allowed. But the importance of the meal was not determined by luxury. It was determined by timing. The meal arrived when the day was ending. It gave the household a reason to sit together, and around that shared food, the ancient evening began to become something more than the absence of daylight. It became a ritual. a place where the day's worries could be spoken, where tired bodies could recover, where families could remain together for a little longer before everyone finally disappeared into the darkness of sleep. The small flame had made the gathering possible. Now the meal would give that gathering a purpose. And after the meal, when the dishes had been put aside and the fire had settled into a softer glow, there would still be one thing that human beings across countless cultures had always been drawn toward when the day became quiet. They would begin to talk, and eventually someone would begin to tell a story. Once the lamp had been lit, and the household had gathered into its small circle of light, the ancient evening moved toward its most familiar ritual, food. For most people, the meal at the end of the day was not simply a way to replace the energy lost through hours of work. It was the moment when the household finally stopped moving in separate directions and became a single group again. Fields, workshops, markets, roads, and animals could wait until morning. For a little while, everyone belonged to the same room, the same fire, and the same table or eating space. The exact meal differed enormously from one place to another. A wealthy Roman household could serve several courses while guests reclined and talked for hours, while a farming family might have little more than bread or grain, vegetables, olives, cheese, or whatever food had been available that season.
Fish and meat were not equally common for everyone, and sweet foods were often luxuries rather than everyday comforts. Yet the emotional function of the evening meal could remain remarkably similar even when the food itself was completely different. It created a pause between labor and sleep.
The body was fed, the family was gathered, and the pace of the day began to slow. In the Greek world, the evening meal could develop into a long social occasion among those who possessed the time and resources for it. After eating came conversation, music, poetry, drinking, and discussion. The famous symposium belonged to this wider evening culture. Although later generations often remember these gatherings for philosophy, politics, and wine, there was something simpler underneath them. People were reluctant to let the social world of the day disappear immediately. The meal became a gradual descent into night, with the warm light of lamps replacing the sunlight outside, and conversation continuing as the darkness deepened. For ordinary families, the experience was much less elaborate, but perhaps even more intimate. The people sharing the same household ate together because there was little reason to separate themselves once the day's work had ended. Someone might talk about what had happened in the fields. Someone else might mention a visitor, a neighbor, a market exchange, or a problem that needed to be dealt with the following morning. Children were fed and settled. Older members of the household rested. Small pieces of the day's experience were exchanged until the urgency of daylight began to disappear. This matters because conversation itself could become part of the preparation for sleep.
During the day, attention had to remain focused on immediate problems. A farmer could not stop in the middle of work to worry endlessly about tomorrow's harvest. A craftsperson could not spend an hour thinking about an argument while trying to complete a task.
But once the work ended, thoughts that had been pushed aside during the day could return. The evening meal gave those thoughts somewhere to go. They could be spoken aloud, answered by someone else, laughed about, argued over, or simply allowed to fade into the background while other people talked. There was also the physical comfort of eating after sustained work. Ancient people who had spent much of the day walking, lifting, carrying, digging, grinding, harvesting, weaving, or tending animals experienced hunger as a very ordinary part of life. A warm meal, therefore, carried a satisfaction that is difficult to separate from the emotional atmosphere of the evening. The body received food, the hands stopped working, and the mind received permission to slow down. The simple act of sitting down to eat could become a signal that the demanding part of the day had ended. Drinks played their own role. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, people consumed various forms of wine, often diluted with water, while other cultures relied on beer, fermented drinks, herbal preparations, or simple water, depending on place and circumstance.
Some sweet or warm drinks were valued for comfort, and honey appeared frequently in ancient food and medicinal traditions. None of this should be mistaken for an ancient science of sleep.
People were not secretly following modern sleep protocols. They were responding to ordinary experiences of warmth, fullness, tiredness, and relaxation, using whatever foods and drinks their culture made available. And there was another important feature of the meal. It happened while the outside world was disappearing. The fading light changed the atmosphere around the food. A meal eaten beneath the open daylight belonged to the active part of the day. A meal eaten beside a lamp or hearth belonged to the evening. The difference was not only visual. The sounds of the household changed. Work became quieter. Voices became softer. Movements became slower. The darkness outside made the small interior space feel more important, and the meal became a kind of boundary between the world of activity and the world of rest. In some homes, the fire itself became part of that transition. It might be used for cooking and then carefully reduced after the meal. The embers were not treated casually. Fire was essential, but fire was dangerous. A careless spark in a house, constructed from wood, reeds, thatch, or other flammable materials, could turn a quiet night into disaster. So the evening meal existed alongside another task that would become increasingly important as bedtime approached: preparing the household fire for the night. The ancient evening, therefore, had an unusual combination of comfort and responsibility.
People were relaxing, but they were not free from practical concerns. Someone still had to make sure the animals were secure. Someone had to check the doorway. Someone had to manage the fire. Someone might need to prepare the sleeping place. The night could not simply be ignored. It had to be managed.
Yet once these responsibilities were completed, something remarkable happened. The household became quieter, without anyone needing to command it to do so. The meal ended. Bowls and cups were set aside. The fire burned lower. The lamp became the dominant source of light. The darkness outside grew deeper, but inside, people remained together. And this was when another ancient technology of rest began to take over. Not a lamp, not a bed, not medicine, a voice. For thousands of years, before books became common household objects, and before screens could occupy the final hour before sleep, human beings had another way to occupy the mind at night. They told stories. Someone remembered an old tale. Someone repeated a story that everyone already knew. An elder recited a legend. A parent sang to a child. A traveler described something seen on a distant road. The evening, which had begun with food, gradually became a time for memory and imagination. Stories were especially powerful because they gave the mind somewhere else to go. A person lying awake in darkness could think about tomorrow's work, a difficult conversation, an uncertain harvest, a sick family member, money, danger, or grief. But when another person's voice began unfolding a familiar story, attention could move away from those private concerns. The mind followed the sequence of events being spoken aloud. A character appeared. A journey began. A problem emerged. The listener waited to discover what happened next. The world inside the story temporarily became more immediate than the worries inside the listener's own head. For children, this could become a lullaby or a simple repeated tale. For adults, it could be a myth, an epic, a family story, a piece of news, or a conversation that continued long after the food was gone. The important thing was not always the content. It was the presence of another human voice in the darkness. That voice transformed the atmosphere of the room. The lamp flickered. The fire settled. The meal was finished. Outside, the settlement became quiet. And inside, someone continued speaking. This was the ancient evening at its most human. There was no need for spectacular entertainment. There was simply food, warmth, familiar faces, and a story being carried from one person to another. Eventually, even the storyteller would become tired. The words would become slower. The children would stop responding. Someone would yawn. The conversation would lose its urgency. And one by one, the people gathered around the light would begin to prepare for sleep. But before the final words disappeared into the darkness, the ancient world had one of its oldest and most powerful ways of calming the mind still waiting. The voice itself could become a story. The story could become a song, and the song could become the oldest bedtime ritual of all. Long before there were books beside the bed, there were voices in the dark. For most of human history, the evening story was not something a person consumed from a page or a screen. It was something another human being carried into the room with nothing more than memory and a voice. When the day's work was finished and the household had gathered around the remaining warmth of the fire, someone might begin speaking almost casually, perhaps with a story everyone had heard before, perhaps with something remembered from childhood, perhaps with a tale brought home by a traveler. The story did not need to be written down because it already existed inside the people who knew it. One generation remembered it, repeated it, changed it slightly, and passed it to the next, allowing entire worlds to survive for centuries through nothing more permanent than human speech. This made the evening a very different kind of experience from the one we know today. Darkness removed much of the visual world, and when there was little left to look at, attention naturally moved toward sound. The crackle of the fire became noticeable. The movement of someone preparing a sleeping place became part of the quiet background, and the human voice became unusually powerful. A familiar voice could fill a dark room without needing anything else. It could make people laugh, remember, wonder, or simply remain awake for a little longer without demanding the kind of attention that daytime work required. The voice became a bridge between wakefulness and sleep, carrying the listener away from the immediate concerns of the day and into a world created entirely through words. That mattered because the mind does not always become quiet simply because the body is tired. A farmer could finish an exhausting day and still lie awake thinking about the weather. A mother could still worry about a sick child. A craftsman could replay an argument that had happened earlier. A traveler might remember a dangerous road, and an old person might find themselves thinking about people who were no longer alive. Ancient people had no modern terminology for racing thoughts or sleep anxiety, but they knew the experience itself. The mind could continue working long after the hands had stopped, and one of the simplest ways to interrupt that internal noise was to give the mind another story to follow. A storyteller did exactly that. Once a narrative began, the listener no longer had to decide what to think about next because the voice was providing the sequence. Someone had left home, someone was traveling, someone had encountered danger, someone had made a promise, someone was searching for something, and eventually something would happen. The listener could simply follow. The story created a temporary structure inside the mind, and that structure could be comforting because it was more orderly than the uncertain thoughts of ordinary life. Even when the stories themselves involved monsters, battles, gods, disasters, or journeys into dangerous places, The act of listening could still be calming, because the listener knew that the story belonged to someone else's world and that, for the moment, they could simply remain where they were. The great stories of the ancient world were therefore not only entertainment. Many of the epics that later became famous as written literature began their lives as spoken traditions, carried by performers and remembered by communities long before they were fixed on a page. The people listening to these stories did not experience them as we experience an ancient book today. They heard them through a living human voice, often surrounded by other people, perhaps beside a fire or beneath a dark sky, with the rhythm of speech providing its own kind of repetition. A familiar story could become almost ritualistic because everyone already knew its major turns, yet knowing what would happen did not necessarily make it boring. Familiarity itself could be comforting, especially at the end of a long day, when the mind was looking for something predictable rather than something demanding. This may explain why repetition appears so often in the oldest forms of bedtime comfort. A child who hears the same lullaby night after night is not asking for originality. The child is asking for recognition. The melody is familiar, the rhythm is predictable, and the voice is known. Nothing unexpected is required. The song begins, the same pattern returns, and eventually the child's attention becomes less focused on the individual words and more absorbed by the rhythm itself. Long before anyone could describe this in terms of psychology or nervous system regulation, human beings discovered that repetition could make darkness feel safer. The lullaby may be one of the clearest examples of this ancient instinct. Across widely separated cultures, people developed songs designed specifically to settle children, using slow rhythms, repeated phrases, gentle melodies, and soft voices. The exact words differed from place to place, and the beliefs surrounding the songs could be completely different, but the basic human action remained remarkably consistent. Someone held or watched over a small child in the dark and used their own voice to communicate calm. The song did not need to solve the child's problems. It simply needed to continue. As long as the familiar voice remained, the child was not alone in the darkness. And the bedtime story was never exclusively a children's tradition. Adults listened too, although their stories could take very different forms.
They might hear myths explaining the origins of a people, tales about heroes and gods, stories of ancestors, accounts of distant places, local legends, or simple stories that had been repeated so many times that they had become part of the identity of the household itself. In societies where written material was scarce or inaccessible, spoken stories carried information that might otherwise have disappeared. They preserved memory, explained customs, warned against dangers, entertained tired workers, and connected people who had never met with generations that had lived long before them.
There was also something deeply social about this way of ending the day. Modern entertainment can place a person in front of a screen while everyone else in the same room disappears into separate worlds. Ancient storytelling required presence.
Someone had to speak, someone had to listen, and usually other people were doing the same thing at the same time. The storyteller could hear laughter, questions, interruptions, or silence. The audience could recognize familiar phrases and anticipate what was coming.
The story therefore became a shared experience rather than a private one, and that shared attention created another layer of security inside the night. Eventually, however, even the most interesting story began to lose its hold on an exhausted body. The storyteller's voice might become slower. The listeners might stop responding. A child might fall asleep before the story ended, and an adult might continue listening with half-closed eyes, no longer caring how the tale concluded. The fire would have burned lower by then, and the lamp would cast a smaller circle of light across the room. Outside, the darkness would have become complete, but inside, the household would have begun its final descent toward sleep. For some people, the voice that carried them through the last part of the evening was not a storyteller at all. It was the voice of prayer. The same instinct that had led people to gather around stories could lead them toward repeated words spoken for protection, forgiveness, gratitude, or hope. Before surrendering consciousness to the darkness, a person could speak words that had been spoken by countless others before them, placing the coming night inside a familiar ritual. The story had given the mind somewhere to go. The prayer would now give it something to release. And this is where the ancient evening begins to reveal something deeper than a collection of historical customs. The lamp, the meal, the story, the song, and eventually the prayer were not isolated inventions. Together, they formed a gradual process of letting go. Daylight had demanded attention, movement, work, decisions, and vigilance. The evening slowly removed those demands one by one. First the work ended, then the meal gathered the household, then the story occupied the mind, then the familiar words of prayer prepared the person for the final surrender. Sleep did not arrive as a sudden interruption of life. It was the final stage of a long transition that had been unfolding since sunset. The ancient storyteller could not have known anything about modern theories of attention, sleep cycles, or nervous system regulation. They did not need to. They knew that a quiet voice could settle a restless child. They knew that familiar stories could occupy a troubled mind. They knew that a repeated song could become comforting through sheer familiarity. And they knew that the presence of another human being in the darkness could make the night feel less threatening. When the final story ended, silence did not immediately mean sleep. There was still one more ancient question to answer, and it was perhaps the most important question of all. If a person was about to close their eyes and surrender control of the night, who or what would protect them while they slept? For the ancient world, that question rarely had a simple answer. Gods watched over households. Spirits were feared. Protective objects were placed near beds. Words were spoken against nightmares. Prayers were repeated before the final light disappeared. Across civilizations, people developed different answers to the same vulnerability, and many of those answers were woven directly into the final minutes before sleep. The storyteller's voice faded. The child became still. The fire settled into embers. The lamp continued burning quietly, and in the darkness beyond the small circle of light, the household prepared to place itself under the protection of something greater than human wakefulness. Before sleep, they would pray. When the last story faded and the household became quieter, the ancient evening often moved toward another kind of voice. This time, it was not the voice of a storyteller carrying listeners into another world, but the voice of a person speaking toward a world beyond the room itself. Across many ancient cultures, prayer became part of the final preparation for sleep, and the reason was remarkably simple. Sleep meant becoming unable to protect yourself. For several hours, the person lying down could not watch the doorway, tend the fire, respond to danger, or control what happened around them. To close the eyes was to surrender the ordinary powers of waking life. And in a world where darkness carried genuine uncertainty, that surrender naturally created a desire for protection. The words differed from civilization to civilization, but the emotional purpose could be surprisingly similar. A person might ask a god to guard the household, protect the children, keep away illness, prevent frightening dreams, or allow the sleeper to reach the morning safely. These prayers were not necessarily elaborate theological statements. Sometimes they were short formulas repeated night after night, words so familiar that the person saying them barely needed to think about each sentence. Their importance came partly from repetition. The same words, spoken in the same order at the same point in the evening, could become a signal that the day was finished and that the responsibilities of waking life could finally be put down.
Some of the oldest evidence for this relationship between sleep and protection comes from the ancient Near East. In Mesopotamian traditions, the night could be populated by forces that ordinary people believed might influence dreams, illness, or misfortune.
Written prayers and protective incantations were used to guard against harmful supernatural forces, and dreams could be treated as significant experiences rather than meaningless fragments of a sleeping mind. The darkness, therefore, required its own kind of preparation. A person did not simply lie down and assume that the hours before sunrise would pass without consequence. Words, rituals, and protective practices could be used to make the coming night feel safer. This way of thinking becomes particularly interesting when we consider what a dream meant to an ancient person. Today, most people wake from a strange dream and eventually dismiss it as something produced by the sleeping brain. Ancient cultures often approached dreams differently. A dream might be treated as a warning, a message, an omen, or a meeting with something beyond ordinary human experience. That belief made sleep more mysterious, but it also gave it a kind of significance. The sleeper was not simply disappearing from consciousness for several hours. They might be entering a realm where another kind of knowledge could become available. The Egyptians developed some of the most elaborate ideas surrounding protection during sleep. Their understanding of the night was connected to their larger religious picture of the cosmos, including the nightly journey of the sun through darkness before its return at dawn. The disappearance of sunlight was therefore not merely an everyday event. It belonged to a cosmic pattern in which light itself passed through danger and emerged again. Human beings, sleeping through the night, could surround themselves with symbols, protective objects, and religious practices that reflected this larger understanding of darkness, danger, death, and renewal. Even the objects placed around a sleeping person could carry this meaning. Egyptian headrests, for example, were not simply practical supports for the head. Their distinctive curved form had symbolic associations, and some were decorated with protective figures intended to guard the sleeper. The object beneath the head could therefore become part of the ritual environment of sleep. It supported the body physically, while also representing protection spiritually. The sleeper entered the darkness, surrounded not only by blankets and walls, but by symbols that were believed to stand watch when the person themselves could not. That idea appears repeatedly across the ancient world. When the human body becomes helpless, protection must somehow be placed around it. Sometimes that protection came from gods, sometimes from household spirits, sometimes from amulets or charms, sometimes from prayers repeated before sleep, and sometimes it was much more practical. A barred door, a carefully covered fire, family members sleeping close together, and a lamp burning nearby. The boundaries between practical protection and supernatural protection were often much less distinct than they are for us. A person could secure the door and say a prayer without seeing any contradiction between the two. The Roman household provides another example of this intimate relationship between domestic life and protection. Roman religion was not limited to magnificent temples or public ceremonies.
The home itself could contain sacred spaces associated with household gods and protective spirits. These figures belonged to ordinary domestic life, and their presence connected everyday actions: eating, preparing food, honoring ancestors, caring for the household, with a larger religious order.
As evening approached, the household could therefore move naturally from ordinary activities towards small acts of devotion, placing the family once again beneath the protection of familiar spiritual powers. The important point is not whether every ancient person sincerely believed every supernatural explanation surrounding sleep. Historical evidence rarely allows us to look directly into the private mind of an ordinary sleeper. What we can see is the repeated appearance of rituals designed to make the transition into darkness feel controlled, meaningful, and safe. People did not have to understand the psychology behind a ritual for the ritual to influence their emotional state. Performing the same action every evening could create familiarity, and familiarity matters greatly when the surrounding environment is uncertain. There is something especially powerful about repetition at the end of the day. During daylight, life constantly demands adaptation. Weather changes, people arrive unexpectedly, animals behave unpredictably, work goes wrong, and plans have to be altered. But a nightly ritual can remain exactly the same. The same words can be spoken, the same fire can be checked, the same sleeping place can be prepared. The same protective object can be placed beside the bed. The repetition tells the mind that, despite everything that happened during the day, this part remains familiar. This may help explain why prayer became so deeply connected with bedtime in later religious traditions. In the Christian world, evening prayer eventually developed into formal nightly offices intended to bring the day to completion. One of the best-known traditions was Compline, whose name is connected to the idea of completing the day's cycle of prayer. The practice created a deliberate pause before sleep. The day was reviewed, burdens were acknowledged, failures could be confessed, and the coming night was placed into God's protection. The point was not simply to say religious words and immediately fall asleep. It was to create a final boundary between the concerns of daylight and the vulnerability of night. That distinction is important because the mind does not always know when a day is finished. A person can physically leave the workplace while continuing to think about everything that happened there. An argument can end but continue inside the mind. A problem can remain unsolved long after the tools have been put away. Ancient evening prayers offered a formal way to say that enough had been done for today. The problem might not be solved. Tomorrow might still contain uncertainty. But for the night, the burden could be placed somewhere else. In this sense, the prayer before sleep served two purposes at once. It asked for protection from the outside world, but it also helped organize the inside world of the person who was praying. Repeated words gave the mind a narrow path to follow. The familiar sequence reduced the need for decision-making. Instead of continuing to search through every worry that had accumulated during the day, the person returned to words they already knew. The ritual became a kind of mental doorway, and once they had passed through it, the rest of the night could begin. This does not mean ancient people had discovered some perfect method for sleeping. They still suffered from nightmares. They still woke in fear. They still lost sleep because of illness, grief, hunger, pain, and anxiety. Prayer could not eliminate those things. What it could do was give the sleeper a framework for facing them. The night no longer felt like an empty period in which anything might happen. It belonged to a pattern. Darkness came. The household gathered. The ritual was performed. Protection was requested. Then the person lay down and waited for morning. And perhaps that is why the ancient bedtime prayer remains so recognizable even after the religious beliefs surrounding it have changed. At its deepest level, it expresses a very old human desire, to know that someone or something is watching while we sleep. The person lying down wants to believe that the door will remain closed, the fire will remain safe, the family will remain unharmed, and the morning will eventually arrive. The prayer gives words to that hope. But prayer was not the only thing ancient people used to change the atmosphere of the room. They understood that the mind could be influenced not only by words and beliefs, but by the physical senses themselves. The quality of light mattered, warmth mattered, food mattered, and another sense, one we often underestimate, could transform an entire evening without requiring a single sentence. Scent. Long before modern perfumes, candles, and aromatherapy existed as industries, people burned resins, woods, herbs, and aromatic substances in temples and homes. Fragrant smoke rose through the darkness, mixed with the smell of the hearth and lamp oil, and became part of the sensory experience of evening. Some scents belonged to religion, some to medicine, some to luxury, and some simply to the pleasure of making a living space smell better. The ancient evening, it seems, was not only something people saw and heard, it was something they smelled. And once the prayer had been spoken and the last words of the day had begun to disappear, that fragrance would become another quiet signal that the world of work was ending and the world of rest was beginning. Once the final prayer had been spoken, another part of the ancient evening began to take shape, almost without anyone noticing. The room had already changed in a dozen small ways. The daylight was gone, the lamp had replaced the sun, the meal was finished, voices had become quieter, and the household had begun to withdraw from the demands of the outside world. But the atmosphere of the room was not created by light and sound alone. Ancient people also lived in a world filled with smells, and certain fragrances could become so closely associated with sacred places, familiar homes, medicine, warmth, and rest, that they became part of the emotional experience of night itself. Scent was everywhere in the ancient world, but it was not experienced as something purely decorative. Fragrant substances could carry religious meaning, social meaning, medicinal meaning, and personal meaning all at once. Resins were burned in temples, aromatic woods were used in rituals, herbs were dried and stored, oils were prepared for the body, and spices could be mixed into preparations used for both pleasure and healing. The smell of a room could tell a person where they were, what was happening, and what kind of moment they had entered. The fragrance of a temple was different from the smell of a workshop, just as the scent of a cooking fire was different from the perfumes used by wealthier households. Among the most important of these fragrances was incense. Across parts of Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean world, and beyond, people burned aromatic substances whose smoke slowly filled the surrounding space. The materials varied widely, but resins, woods, herbs, and spices could all be used, depending on the region and the purpose.
In religious settings, fragrant smoke was often associated with the presence of the sacred. It rose toward the heavens, surrounded images of gods, accompanied prayers, and transformed an ordinary room into a place that felt separated from everyday life. The smell itself could become a signal. This is no longer ordinary time.
That quality made fragrance particularly powerful in the evening. A familiar scent can become connected to a particular place or repeated experience, and when the same fragrance returns again and again, it can carry memories with it. Ancient people did not describe this in terms of neuroscience, but they understood the practical experience. A certain oil might remind someone of a temple. A particular herb might be associated with a mother's home. The smell of burning wood might mean that the day's work was over and the family was gathering. The scent of warm food, smoke, lamp oil, and herbs could combine into an atmosphere that belonged specifically to nighttime.
In wealthier households, fragrance could be much more elaborate. Perfumed oils, aromatic woods, and carefully prepared substances were available to people with enough resources to afford them, and personal fragrance was an important part of ancient life.
But the broader idea did not depend on wealth. Even an ordinary household possessed its own characteristic smells. Cooking fires, stored grain, dried plants, wool, clay, smoke, animals, and the earth itself all contributed to the atmosphere of a home. At night, when the household became quieter and visual distractions disappeared, those smells could become more noticeable. Certain plants also gained reputations for helping people relax or sleep. Across ancient and medieval traditions, healers recorded plants and preparations believed to calm restlessness or encourage sleep.
Some herbs were brewed into drinks, some were placed near sleeping areas, and others were incorporated into oils or compresses. One of the most famous examples was valerian, a plant whose roots acquired a long reputation for use against sleeplessness and restlessness.
Whether every ancient remedy worked as its users believed is another question. But the persistence of these traditions reveals something important. People had spent thousands of years observing the relationship between particular plants, sensations, and states of mind. The ancient evening was therefore a sensory experience from beginning to end. The eyes adjusted to dim light. The ears became more aware of quiet voices and distant sounds. The skin felt the warmth of the fire or the cooling air after sunset. The body experienced the satisfaction of food after a demanding day, and the nose encountered the familiar combination of smoke, herbs, oils, cooking, wood, and earth. None of these sensations existed separately. Together, they created the environment in which a person gradually moved toward sleep. There is a reason this matters. Sleep does not begin only when the eyes close.
The transition starts earlier, through a gradual reduction in activity and stimulation. Ancient people had no formal bedtime technology designed around this principle, but their environment often produced the transition naturally. Light became dimmer because artificial illumination was limited.
Movement decreased because there was less practical work to do. Conversations slowed because everyone was tired. The household became physically smaller as people moved toward their sleeping spaces, and familiar smells remained around them, reinforcing the sense that they had returned to the same place where they had rested the night before. The repetition of those sensory experiences could itself become comforting. Night after night, the same household produced roughly the same atmosphere. The same hearth was lit. The same cooking area produced familiar smells. The same lamp oil burned. The same people occupied the same rooms. The same sleeping place waited at the end of the evening. Even when the events of the day were unpredictable, the final part of the day could follow a recognizable pattern. That predictability mattered because ancient people lived with considerable uncertainty. The weather could change unexpectedly. Crops could fail. Illness could arrive without warning. Travel could be dangerous. Political events could disturb entire communities. A person could begin the morning without knowing what problem would occupy their mind by sunset, but the evening ritual could remain largely unchanged. The fire would be lit, food would be prepared, prayers would be spoken, and the household would eventually sleep. Ritual did not remove uncertainty from life. It created a small area within life where uncertainty could be temporarily set aside. This is one reason ancient rituals surrounding sleep should not be dismissed as superstition.
Some of the beliefs behind them may seem strange to a modern person, but the human need they addressed was real. A person wanted to feel safe enough to surrender consciousness. They wanted the room to feel familiar, They wanted the night to have an understandable structure.
They wanted some indication that the difficult part of the day had ended. Fragrance, prayer, stories, food and light all contributed to that sense of transition. And nowhere was this combination of sensory experience and spiritual meaning more remarkable than along the Nile. Egyptian evenings were shaped by a landscape that could be intensely hot during the day and unexpectedly beautiful after sunset. The river, the desert, the mud brick settlements, the flat rooftops, and the enormous night sky created a setting unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The Egyptians had developed elaborate ideas about the journey of the sun, the nature of death, the afterlife, dreams, protection, and renewal. Their approach to sleep therefore reveals something especially interesting. For them, the night was not simply the time when the world stopped working. It was part of the larger cosmic order. As the sun disappeared in the west, it was understood to be beginning a dangerous journey through the realm of darkness before its return in the morning. The ordinary person watching sunset could therefore see something more than the end of daylight. The disappearance of the sun echoed a much larger story of death, danger, passage, and rebirth. Night was not merely the absence of the sun, it was a stage in a cycle that would eventually lead back to morning. That understanding changed the emotional meaning of sleep. A person lying down at night was entering the same darkness through which the sun itself had to pass. Protection, therefore, became especially important. Objects, symbols, prayers, and household practices could all be used to surround the sleeper with a sense of security. The sleeping body was vulnerable, but it was not imagined as abandoned. In Egypt, even the sleeping place could carry this message. On warm nights, people could sleep on the flat roofs of their homes, where the air was cooler and the enormous sky stretched above them. The modern imagination tends to picture ancient Egypt through monuments and desert landscapes, but the night sky was just as important. Without the glow of modern cities, the stars would have been dramatically more visible, turning the roof of a house into a place where ordinary domestic life met the vastness of the cosmos. A family lying on a rooftop after the heat of the day had broken would have experienced a very different kind of darkness from the darkness inside a closed room. There might still be distant sounds from the settlement, the movement of the river, the wind passing across the roof, and the faint glow of lamps below. Above them, the stars would remain visible for hours. The sky was not empty. It was a landscape in itself, one that the Egyptians carefully observed and incorporated into their understanding of time, religion, and the afterlife. And beneath that sky, many sleepers rested their heads on an object that looks remarkably strange to modern eyes: the Egyptian headrest. It was not a soft pillow in the modern sense. A typical headrest consisted of a base, a narrow supporting column, and a curved upper surface designed to support the head and neck. Some were made from wood, while others could be produced from stone or more valuable materials. Its shape may appear uncomfortable at first glance, but its continued use over long periods suggests that people adapted to it successfully. It also had practical advantages, including keeping the head elevated above the sleeping surface and potentially providing relief from heat. But the headrest carried meaning beyond physical comfort. Some were decorated with protective imagery, turning an ordinary object into something that could symbolically stand guard over the sleeper. The vulnerable head was placed directly against a structure associated with protection, and the object became part of the ritual environment of sleep. Physical support and spiritual protection could exist together in the same piece of material. This tells us something important about the ancient approach to rest. Comfort did not always mean softness. Comfort could mean security. A hard object could still be reassuring if it represented protection. A familiar prayer could calm the mind even when the danger outside remained real. A lamp could provide only a tiny amount of light and still make an entire household feel safer. The ancient world did not need to eliminate the darkness in order to sleep. It only needed to make the darkness understandable, and that may be the deepest pattern running through everything we have seen so far. The lamp controlled a small piece of the darkness. The meal brought people together. The story occupied the mind. The prayer created a sense of protection. The fragrance changed the atmosphere. The sleeping place became familiar. Each ritual took a small part of an uncertain night and gave it a predictable shape. But the Egyptians went even further. They did not merely prepare for sleep. They wondered what sleep itself meant, because if the night was a passage through darkness, perhaps the sleeping mind was not simply becoming inactive. Perhaps it was entering another realm entirely. And if dreams could carry messages from gods, ancestors, or forces beyond ordinary human understanding, then the act of falling asleep could become something much more extraordinary than rest.
It could become a journey.
And in some of the ancient world's most sacred places, people would deliberately lie down at night, hoping that the darkness would bring them an answer.
Sleep did not always mean the disappearance of consciousness in the ancient world. For many people, it meant entering a different kind of experience, one in which the ordinary rules of waking life no longer seemed to apply.
A person could fall asleep in one place and suddenly find themselves somewhere else, speaking with someone who had died years before, standing before a god, receiving a warning, witnessing an unfamiliar event, or hearing words that seemed to contain an answer to a problem that had troubled them for months.
Modern people may wake from such dreams and call them strange, but many ancient societies treated dreams with far greater seriousness. The sleeping mind was not necessarily considered empty. It could be a doorway. This belief changed the meaning of bedtime.
If dreams were capable of carrying messages, then preparing for sleep was no longer only about becoming physically comfortable. It could also involve preparing the mind and body for an encounter with something beyond ordinary experience. People might wash themselves, fast, pray, make offerings, enter sacred spaces, or perform other rituals before lying down. The purpose was not simply to become tired. It was to become receptive. Sleep could be approached almost as a form of communication, a temporary crossing between the ordinary human world and a realm that could not be reached while fully awake. One of the most remarkable expressions of this idea was dream incubation. The basic principle was simple. If a person believed that a divine power could communicate through dreams, then perhaps a dream could be deliberately sought rather than merely received by chance.
A person with a serious question, a troubling illness, or a desire for guidance could travel to a sacred location and undergo a period of preparation before sleeping there. The journey itself mattered. Leaving home meant leaving ordinary responsibilities behind.
Washing, fasting, prayer, ritual preparation, and the unfamiliar surroundings of the sanctuary all created a psychological separation from normal life. By the time the person finally lay down to sleep, the entire experience had been organized around one expectation: something important might happen during the night. In the ancient Greek world, this practice became especially associated with healing sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. People traveled considerable distances to these sacred places, seeking relief from illness, pain, and uncertainty. The sanctuary was not simply a place where someone arrived and received a treatment in the modern sense.
It was an environment designed around healing, ritual, expectation, and the possibility of divine assistance. After purification and other preparations, the person would sleep within the sacred precinct, hoping that Asclepius would appear in a dream and reveal a cure or provide some form of healing. From a modern perspective, the practice is difficult to evaluate in simple terms. We cannot automatically accept every ancient account as proof that a god physically appeared in someone's dream, but neither do we need to dismiss the entire experience as meaningless.
Consider what the ritual actually did to the person who entered the sanctuary. They had left their ordinary environment. They had traveled toward a place specifically associated with healing. They had undergone preparation. They were surrounded by people who shared the same expectation. They had been told that sleep might bring an answer. Their attention had been removed from the normal pressures of daily life and concentrated on one powerful hope. Then they were allowed to sleep. Whatever happened during the night, the conditions were extraordinary. A frightened or exhausted person had been given permission to stop working, stop traveling, stop making ordinary decisions, and simply rest. The mind had been given a single expectation rather than 100 competing concerns. The darkness was no longer an empty space. It was the place where the answer might arrive. That belief could transform the emotional experience of sleep itself. This is one of the reasons dreams are so important to the history of sleep. They reveal that ancient people were not only concerned with the physical act of lying down, they were trying to understand what happened to the self once consciousness changed. Where did the mind go? Why did dead relatives appear? Why could a person see places they had never visited? Why could a dream feel more vivid than ordinary memory? Why did some dreams seem connected to events that happened later? These questions had no simple answers, and different civilizations developed different explanations. In Mesopotamia, dreams could be treated as meaningful signs that required interpretation. Religious specialists sometimes played a role in understanding what a dream might indicate, especially when the dream was believed to have political, religious, or personal significance. A ruler's dream could carry enormous importance, because the interpretation might influence decisions affecting an entire kingdom. For an ordinary person, a dream might be more personal, a warning, a frightening encounter, a message from the dead, or an indication that something needed attention.
Egyptian traditions also placed great importance on dreams and the protection of the sleeper. The Egyptians had an elaborate religious understanding of the relationship between life, death, the gods, and the nightly journey of the sun. Sleep therefore existed within a larger symbolic landscape.
The person who closed their eyes at night was vulnerable, but they were also entering a period in which the boundary between ordinary life and the supernatural could become less distinct. Protective objects and rituals were intended to guard the sleeper while that boundary was crossed. The idea of protection becomes particularly important here, because dreams could be wonderful, but they could also be terrifying. If a dream might carry a divine message, then a nightmare might be more than an unpleasant experience. It could be interpreted as a warning or an attack. A person who believed that dangerous forces could enter dreams had good reason to prepare the sleeping space carefully. Words could be spoken before sleep. Protective symbols could be placed near the body. Amulets could be worn or positioned nearby. The sleeper could be surrounded by signs that were believed to keep harmful influences away. The Egyptian headrest fits naturally into this world of ideas. Its practical purpose was to support the head, but its symbolic role could be much larger.
Some headrests were decorated with protective figures, including images associated with guarding sleepers from harmful forces. The object was therefore positioned at exactly the place where the dream began to take hold, beneath the head of the sleeping person. The boundary between furniture and ritual object could become almost invisible.
And there is something psychologically fascinating about this arrangement. even without accepting the supernatural beliefs behind it. A person who believes they are protected may fall asleep differently from a person who believes they are exposed. The belief itself changes the emotional environment. A familiar object beside the bed can provide reassurance. A repeated prayer can create confidence. A trusted ritual can tell the mind that the same protection that worked last night will be there tonight. This pattern appears again and again in ancient approaches to sleep. The rituals surrounding the sleeper were designed to reduce uncertainty. The darkness was unpredictable, but the ritual was predictable. The dream might be strange, but the preparation was familiar. The night might contain unknown dangers, but the person did not enter it without preparation. And dreams were not always sought because someone wanted mystical knowledge. Sometimes people simply wanted relief. A sick person who had exhausted ordinary remedies might travel to a healing sanctuary because hope itself had become important. A person grieving a dead relative might want to see that person again. Someone facing a difficult decision might want reassurance. The dream became a place where uncertainty could temporarily be transformed into meaning. That may be one reason dream incubation remained so compelling. It gave people something that ordinary waking life could not always provide. The possibility of an answer when no answer was available. The person could not control what would appear in the dream, but they could control the preparation. They could wash, they could pray, they could fast. They could enter the sacred place. They could lie down with intention, and then they could surrender control and wait. The surrender was essential. You cannot force yourself to dream a particular dream simply by demanding it. Sleep requires the opposite of control. The person prepares everything they can prepare and then lets consciousness loosen its grip. In that sense, dream incubation contained a paradox that runs through the entire history of sleep. The more completely a person tries to control the experience, the harder it becomes to surrender to it. Ancient rituals solved this paradox by giving the person a sequence of actions to perform before the moment when control had to end. Prepare the body, prepare the space, prepare the mind. Speak the prayer, make the request, then sleep. This structure is remarkably close to the broader pattern we have already seen in ordinary households. The ancient evening was a sequence of transitions. Work ended, food was eaten, stories were told, prayers were spoken, the sleeping place was prepared. The body was finally allowed to surrender. Dream incubation simply turned that ordinary transition into something more deliberate, giving sleep a specific purpose. But there was another reason dreams could be so important. They blurred the boundary between memory and imagination. A dream could feel like a place actually visited. A dead person could appear with the same face they had in life. A familiar voice could speak words that seemed completely real. A person could wake with the emotional certainty that something had happened, even when the event existed only inside the mind. Without modern explanations of dreaming, it was entirely reasonable for ancient people to ask whether the dream had come from somewhere else. And perhaps the most powerful dreams were the ones that seemed to come true. A person might dream of an event and later notice something that appeared to match it. A ruler might dream of an omen and interpret a later event through that dream. A grieving person might dream of someone who had died and feel that the person had genuinely returned. Whether coincidence, memory, expectation, or something else was responsible, the emotional effect could be profound. The ancient world therefore treated sleep as more than a biological necessity. It could be religious, symbolic, social, emotional, and mysterious all at once. Yet most people were not spending their nights inside healing temples, waiting for gods to appear. Most people simply wanted to sleep. They had families, chores, fires, animals, and tomorrow's work waiting for them. Their rituals were smaller and more ordinary. They needed the same thing the person in the sacred sanctuary needed: enough safety and enough calm to surrender the waking mind. And this is where the great civilizations begin to look surprisingly similar. The Egyptian might place a protective symbol near the sleeping head. The Greek might sleep in a sacred sanctuary hoping for a healing dream. The Mesopotamian might speak words against a frightening spirit. The Roman might honor the household gods before bed. Different beliefs, different objects, different prayers, but beneath them was the same human vulnerability. Night had arrived. The body was tired. The mind was still awake, and eventually, everyone had to close their eyes. There was, however, one civilization where the ordinary evening offers an especially clear picture of how food, conversation, lamps, household religion, and the fading daylight came together. In the Roman world, dinner could become the great social event of the evening, and the hours between sunset and sleep reveal a society slowly withdrawing from the noise of the day. The Romans did not invent the ancient evening, but they left behind enough evidence to let us see it in unusually vivid detail. And when the lamps were lit inside a Roman home, the streets outside became darker, the doors were secured, the household gathered, and the long dinner began. The ancient night entered one of its most recognizable forms, a form that, despite the distance of nearly 2,000 years, might feel surprisingly familiar. By the time the Roman evening began, the character of the day had already changed. Romans generally rose early, often beginning their most important activities soon after dawn, because daylight was the most useful and dependable source of illumination available to them. Business, legal matters, visits, errands, and much of ordinary work were concentrated in the brighter hours, while the approach of sunset gradually signaled that the active portion of the day was coming to an end. The Roman city did not suddenly become empty when the sun disappeared, but darkness changed the way people moved through it. Streets became less convenient, homes became more important, and the household increasingly turned inward toward food, conversation, lamps, and the familiar people who shared the same roof. For Romans who possessed enough wealth, the evening meal could become the centerpiece of this transition. Dinner, or cena, was not necessarily a quick meal, eaten simply because the body needed food. In affluent households, it could stretch for hours, with guests reclining on couches arranged around the dining space, while food arrived in courses and conversation continued alongside wine, music, poetry, or other entertainment. The posture itself reveals something about the character of the occasion. People were not standing between tasks or eating while preparing to leave for the next responsibility. They were reclining, remaining in one place, allowing the evening to unfold slowly as the daylight disappeared outside. The experience of an ordinary Roman was obviously very different from that of a wealthy host surrounded by guests and servants. But the underlying rhythm could still be similar. Once the day's work was finished, food brought the household together. The meal created a period in which the urgency of daytime could be replaced by conversation and rest. A poor family could not reproduce the elaborate dinners of the elite, but they did not need to. The important thing was that the evening meal marked a boundary. Work had ended. Food was being shared. The household was together. The night had begun. Wine was part of this world as well, although it should not be imagined as an endless flow of undiluted alcohol. Wine was commonly mixed with water, and its place in Roman dining was social as much as intoxicating. People drank while they talked, listened, debated, joked, and remained together. For wealthy Romans, dinner could become a long social performance in which food and drink provided the framework for relationships. For ordinary people, a much simpler meal could accomplish something equally important. It allowed tired people to sit down together and remain in one place after a day spent moving through the demands of work. The lamps that illuminated these evenings were essential. A Roman home could not simply remain as bright after sunset as it had been during daylight. Artificial illumination existed, but it was limited compared with modern standards.
Oil lamps provided small pools of light, and multiple lamps might be needed when a wealthy household wanted to continue activities late into the night. Their flames were warm and unsteady, producing shadows that moved across walls and objects whenever someone walked past. The effect was not simply practical.
It changed the emotional atmosphere of the house. The outside world became dark, while the interior remained visible, warm, and inhabited. That contrast between the darkness outside and the light inside was especially important in Rome, because the city after dark was not always a place where an ordinary person felt completely secure. Crime, disorder, and accidents were genuine concerns, and the crowded streets could become difficult to navigate once daylight disappeared. The household therefore became a kind of refuge. Doors could be closed and secured, shutters could be drawn. The family could withdraw from the public world and settle into the private world of the home. This inward movement was not unique to Rome. We have already seen it in other ancient societies, but the Roman example makes the pattern particularly clear. Darkness changed the geography of daily life. During daylight, the world was large. People traveled through streets, fields, markets, workshops, and public spaces. At night, the world contracted. The important places became the home, the fire, the lamp, the sleeping area, and the people inside the walls. A person did not need to see the entire city. They only needed to know that the people and objects immediately around them were safe. Roman religion was woven into this domestic environment as well. The Roman household was not considered spiritually empty. Domestic shrines and household gods connected the family to protective powers that were honored through small, repeated acts. These practices could involve food offerings, prayers, gestures of respect, and the maintenance of sacred spaces within the home. Religion was therefore not something that belonged only to distant temples. It could be present in the room where a family ate, in the objects they used every day, and in the rituals that accompanied ordinary domestic life. This is important because the evening was precisely the moment when ordinary domestic life became most concentrated. During the day, a Roman might deal with clients, merchants, officials, workers, neighbors, or strangers. At night, the household became the center again. The people who belonged to the home were physically closer, the outside world was less accessible, and familiar rituals regained their importance. The household gods could therefore function not simply as religious figures, but as part of the emotional architecture of home. The Romans also inherited and developed a culture in which storytelling, poetry, recitation, music, and conversation could fill the hours after dinner. In wealthy settings, entertainment could continue long after the food had been eaten. Someone might recite poetry while others listened, or guests might continue discussing politics, philosophy, gossip, or events from the city. This could make the evening surprisingly long for people with enough money to afford lamps and servants.
The night was no longer controlled entirely by the setting sun. because wealth allowed some people to purchase additional hours of artificial light. For most people, however, there were limits. Oil cost money. Lamps required fuel. There was little reason to remain awake indefinitely, simply because it was technically possible.
Artificial light existed, but it was not abundant enough to make nighttime feel like daytime. The natural rhythm of darkness therefore remained powerful. Eventually, the lamp would burn lower, conversation would slow, and the practical advantages of remaining awake would disappear. This difference between the wealthy and the ordinary household is worth remembering, because ancient sleep was never one universal experience. A Roman aristocrat, reclining at a long dinner, was living in a different world from a laborer who had spent the day carrying materials or working a small plot of land. One person could afford many lamps and hours of entertainment. Another might have only a small flame and a simple meal. Yet both eventually reached the same basic destination. The household quieted. The body became tired. The night deepened. Sleep arrived. The sleeping arrangements themselves varied widely.
Ancient Roman homes could contain different spaces for different purposes, and wealthy households had greater privacy and comfort than ordinary families. But the basic environmental conditions remained recognizable: darkness, limited artificial light, familiar sounds, and the presence of other people.
A person did not sleep inside a perfectly silent, climate-controlled room, isolated from the world. The night had sounds, animals moved, neighbors could be heard, the building itself shifted and creaked. Street activity might continue outside. The sleeper remained connected to the environment, even while unconscious. That makes the ancient experience of nighttime especially interesting. Modern sleep is often associated with isolation from stimulation. We close doors, block out light, reduce noise, control temperature, and attempt to create an environment in which nothing disturbs us. Ancient people had far less control. They had to accommodate the night rather than completely redesign it. The sounds of animals, weather, family members, and distant activity were simply part of sleeping. And perhaps they were less disturbed by this because they did not expect the night to be perfectly silent. Their definition of normal sleep was shaped by the environment they had always known: a dog moving outside the house, someone coughing in another sleeping space, the fire shifting, or a child waking briefly would not necessarily mean that something had gone wrong. The night was alive with small sounds, and people learned to sleep within them. There was also the question of temperature. In the Mediterranean world, the evening could bring relief from the heat of the day, and the cooler night air could make sleeping more comfortable. This was particularly significant in places where daytime heat made indoor activity difficult.
The Roman evening was therefore not simply darker than the afternoon. It could also be physically different. The air cooled, the pace of life slowed. People could sit outside or near open spaces, depending on their circumstances, and enjoy a period when the environment finally became easier on the body.
As the hours passed, however, even the social Roman evening had to come to an end. The guests eventually left or settled into the household. The lamps continued burning, but the conversations became quieter. The servants completed the remaining tasks. The doors were secured. The domestic shrine remained where it had always been. The family moved towards sleep. And here, the Roman evening returns us to the same pattern we have encountered everywhere else. Gather together, eat, talk, create light, seek protection, then let the day disappear. Different civilizations gave these actions different meanings, but the underlying rhythm remained remarkably stable.
Human beings needed a way to move from the active world into the vulnerable state of sleep, and they repeatedly surrounded that transition with familiar things. Food made the body comfortable. Conversation occupied the mind. Light created a sense of safety. Ritual gave the evening structure.
The household provided companionship. But there was another possibility hiding inside the ancient night, one that the Romans and their neighbors did not necessarily recognize as a problem. What if waking in the middle of the night was not a failure?
What if a person did not always sleep from the moment they lay down until the moment the sun rose? Modern people are often taught to think of sleep as one continuous block. We go to bed, close our eyes, and expect to remain asleep until morning.
If we wake at 3 in the morning, we may immediately look at the clock, calculate how many hours remain, and begin worrying about how tired we will be tomorrow. But historical evidence suggests that people in parts of the pre-modern world may have experienced the night differently. They may have gone to sleep after darkness fell, slept for several hours, awakened naturally, remained awake for a quiet period in the middle of the night, and then returned to sleep. A first sleep, a second sleep.
The idea sounds strange, because our modern expectations are so different. Yet references to this pattern appear in historical sources, and although historians continue to debate how widespread and consistent it really was, the possibility opens a remarkable window into the ancient relationship with nighttime. If waking at 3 in the morning was once considered ordinary rather than alarming, then perhaps the ancient night was not always experienced as one long period of unconsciousness. Perhaps there was a quiet space in between.
A time when the fire might still glow, a time when the household was mostly asleep, a time when the darkness outside was at its deepest, and a time when a person could simply lie awake without immediately deciding that something had gone wrong. The idea becomes even more fascinating when we consider what a person might have done during that interval. They might have prayed. They might have spoken quietly with someone nearby. They might have reflected on a dream. They might have tended the fire. They might simply have remained awake in the darkness until sleep returned. There was no glowing phone demanding attention, no digital clock announcing the exact minute, no sleep tracker informing them that their night had been interrupted. There was simply the night. And perhaps, for some people, that was enough. The history of first and second sleep is complicated, and it should not be turned into a simple claim that everyone in the ancient world slept in 2 identical blocks. The evidence is uneven, and scholars disagree about how widespread the practice actually was. But the historical possibility is important because it challenges one of our most deeply held assumptions, that waking during the night is automatically a problem. Maybe the ancient world had a different relationship with those hours. Maybe darkness was not something to defeat. Maybe wakefulness was not something to fight. And maybe the most surprising lesson of the ancient night was waiting in the hours between one sleep and the next. The idea of a first sleep and a second sleep changes the way the ancient night looks. Instead of imagining darkness as one long stretch in which a person simply disappeared until sunrise, we can begin to see the possibility of a night divided into different phases. The first surrender to sleep, a period of quiet wakefulness, and then another descent into rest. The evidence for this pattern is not universal, and historians continue to debate how widespread it actually was. But references to a first and second sleep appear often enough in historical sources to make the idea difficult to ignore.
More importantly, the concept gives us a glimpse of a relationship with nighttime that feels very different from our own. For a person living in a world without electric clocks and constant artificial light, waking in the middle of the night did not necessarily carry the same psychological meaning that it does today.
There was no immediate reason to calculate how many hours remained before morning. The darkness outside gave no precise indication of the time. If the household was quiet and the fire still contained a little warmth, a person who woke after several hours might simply remain where they were. There was nothing to check, and nowhere urgent to go. The night could be experienced as a period of time rather than a problem that needed to be solved. This is where the idea becomes especially interesting. Modern sleepers often treat unexpected wakefulness as an enemy. The moment the eyes open, the mind can begin measuring the damage. How long have I been awake? How much sleep have I lost? How many hours remain before I have to get up? Will I be exhausted tomorrow? Those questions can transform a few quiet minutes into an increasingly stressful experience. The ancient person who accepted nighttime wakefulness as part of the ordinary rhythm of the night may have had a very different emotional response. If waking was expected, there was nothing to fear from being awake. The historical descriptions of this interval suggest that it could be surprisingly peaceful. People might talk quietly with someone who was awake beside them, pray, reflect on the events of the day, tend the household fire, or simply remain still until sleep returned naturally. The activities were usually small because the middle of the night was not a second daytime. There was no reason to begin serious work or entertainment. The darkness remained outside, the household remained quiet, and the person existed in a strange space between sleeping and waking. That quiet interval may also have been a time for remembering dreams. In cultures where dreams were considered meaningful, waking naturally during the night created an opportunity to hold on to them before they disappeared. A person could replay the images in their mind, discuss them softly with someone nearby, or simply think about what they might mean. The dream was still fresh, because the person had only just left it. By morning, much of it might have vanished, but in the middle of the night, it could feel almost as vivid as waking memory. Prayer could also fit naturally into these hours.
A person who had already prayed before sleep might repeat familiar words after waking, especially if the night felt uncertain or a dream had frightened them. In religious traditions, nighttime wakefulness could become an opportunity for reflection rather than frustration.
The person did not have to force themselves back into sleep immediately. They could allow the mind to settle, let the thoughts of the day pass through, and eventually return to rest when the body was ready. The fire was another practical reason to wake. In a world where warmth and cooking depended on a hearth, the fire could not simply be forgotten until morning. Someone might need to check the embers, adjust the fuel, or make sure the household remained safe. The task could be small and familiar, requiring little mental effort. The person would move through the dark room, feel the remaining warmth, perhaps stir the ashes, and return to bed. Such an activity would have been completely ordinary, yet it also reveals how different the ancient night was from ours. The household itself needed attention, even while everyone was sleeping. The sleeping environment was different as well. Ancient households were often shared spaces, and privacy was limited compared with modern expectations. Several people might sleep in the same room or nearby areas, depending on their circumstances. Children, parents, servants, and other members of the household could all be within hearing distance. Someone waking in the middle of the night was therefore not necessarily alone. A whisper, a movement, or the sound of another person breathing could remind the sleeper that the household was still there. That presence may have reduced some of the fear associated with darkness. A person who wakes alone in a completely silent modern bedroom can feel strangely isolated, especially when the rest of the world appears to be asleep. An ancient person, surrounded by family members, might experience the same waking differently. The night was dark, but human presence remained close. The body could remain still, while the mind listened to the small sounds of the household. Breathing, shifting, the occasional cough, the movement of an animal, or the faint crackle of the remaining fire.
There is also an important distinction between being awake and being fully active. Modern life often encourages the idea that every waking moment should be filled with something. If we cannot sleep, we reach for a device. We read, we watch, we scroll, we search.
We consume information until the mind becomes exhausted enough to try sleeping again. Ancient people had far fewer opportunities to stimulate themselves during the deepest hours of the night. Once the lamp was extinguished or reduced to a minimal flame, there was simply not much to do. That limitation may have been frustrating at times, but it also created a kind of enforced stillness. The night could not easily be transformed back into daytime. A person could not brighten the entire room with a switch and begin another round of activity. There was no endless stream of entertainment waiting in the darkness. The world remained dark, and the human body had to negotiate with that fact. This is one of the reasons artificial light is so important to the larger story of sleep. Light did more than make it possible to see after sunset. It gradually changed the boundaries of the day itself. As lighting technologies improved, people gained the ability to remain active long after natural darkness would previously have ended the day's practical possibilities. The evening became longer. Work could continue. Social life could continue. Reading could continue. Travel became easier. Eventually, the electric light transformed the night almost completely. But before that transformation, darkness imposed limits. Those limits shaped behavior. If you wanted to work, you needed enough light. If you wanted to read, you needed enough light. If you wanted to travel, you needed enough light, or a very good reason to take the risk. If you wanted to remain awake for hours, you needed fuel for the lamps or fire. For ordinary people, those limitations made late-night wakefulness relatively impractical. The night therefore encouraged sleep without anyone having to make a deliberate decision about sleep hygiene. The environment itself was doing part of the work. This does not mean everyone slept perfectly or followed an identical two-sleep pattern. That would go beyond what the evidence can support. Some people undoubtedly slept in different ways depending on climate, occupation, age, social status, household conditions, and individual habit. The historical references to first and second sleep should therefore be treated as evidence of a possible and perhaps widespread pattern, not as proof that every ancient person followed the same schedule every night. Still, the idea is valuable because it challenges our assumptions. We tend to believe that our current sleep pattern must be the natural pattern because it feels normal to us. But human beings have always adapted their routines to their environments. Change the light, change the work schedule, change the temperature, change the social structure, and the shape of the night can change as well. The ancient world had a very different relationship with darkness, and darkness shaped the way people experienced time. A night could feel enormous. A few hours of wakefulness could pass without being measured precisely. The person lying awake did not necessarily know whether it was 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock. They knew only that it was still dark, and that morning had not arrived. That uncertainty might sound inconvenient, but it also removed a particular kind of pressure. There was no glowing number to stare at, no exact measurement of lost sleep, no digital confirmation that another 20 minutes had passed. Time existed through sensation, the depth of the darkness, the cooling or warming air, the state of the fire, the sounds of animals, and eventually the first signs of dawn. And dawn mattered enormously.
Morning was not merely another point on a clock. Morning was the return of the useful world. Light came back. Paths became visible. Work became possible. People could travel safely again.
Animals could be tended. Markets could open. Fields could be entered. The darkness that had seemed so complete only hours earlier began to retreat. This made sleep feel connected to something larger than an individual's schedule. The person was not simply waiting for an alarm, they were waiting for the world itself to become visible again. Perhaps this is why the ancient night could contain a strange combination of vulnerability and patience. Darkness could be dangerous, but it was temporary. Sleep could make a person helpless, but morning would eventually restore their ability to act. The fire could become dangerously low, but the household knew that daylight would return. A dream could frighten someone, but eventually the sun would rise and return the world to ordinary reality. The night had an ending built into it. That knowledge may have made it easier to surrender, and there was another lesson hidden in the possibility of first and second sleep. The ancient person who woke in the middle of the night did not necessarily have to fight the experience. They could simply be awake. They could allow the darkness to remain dark, allow the mind to wander quietly, and wait until sleep returned. In our own world, that attitude can seem almost impossible because we have learned to measure sleep so precisely. We know exactly how long we have been awake. We know how many hours remain. We can watch the numbers change while lying motionless in bed. The ancient sleeper had no such measurement. The night was simply there. And perhaps that is why the ancient relationship with nighttime sometimes feels almost contemplative. The world had stopped. The household was quiet. The fire was low. The stars were visible. There was nowhere to rush. There was nothing urgent to accomplish. Eventually, the body would become tired again. Eventually, the second sleep would arrive. And eventually, beyond all those hours of darkness, the first light of morning would begin to appear. But before we leave the night behind, there is one question worth asking. If darkness was so powerful, if sleep made people so vulnerable, and if dreams could carry such deep meaning, what did ancient people actually place around themselves when they finally lay down? What protected the sleeper? What did they sleep on? What did they place beneath their heads? And what objects did they believe could stand between a sleeping body and the dangers that belonged to the dark? The answers take us back to the sleeping places themselves, where practical comfort, symbolism, superstition, and everyday necessity became almost impossible to separate. Because for ancient people, a bed was never simply a place to lie down. It was the final boundary between the human world and the night. The ancient sleeper did not know that centuries later, someone would wonder how they prepared for the night. They did not know that their lamps, their headrests, their prayers, their meals, their stories, and their quiet hours of wakefulness would become pieces of a much larger history. To them, the evening was not history at all. It was simply another evening. The work had ended, the family had gathered, the fire was burning lower, and somewhere outside, the darkness had spread across the fields, the streets, the river, or the desert. Inside the small world of the household, people were preparing to let the day disappear. That is perhaps the most important thing to remember when looking backward at ancient life. We often see the past through its extraordinary moments because those are the moments that leave evidence behind. We see kings being crowned, armies marching, cities being destroyed, temples being constructed, ships crossing seas, and rulers ordering monuments to be built. But ordinary life was made of thousands of moments that nobody thought important enough to record. A person eating the last meal of the day, A mother washing a child's face, someone checking the fire before bed, an old man repeating a familiar prayer, two people whispering after everyone else had fallen asleep, or a child hearing the same lullaby for perhaps the 100th time. These moments rarely entered the official record, yet they were repeated, night after night, by generation after generation. And sleep was one of the greatest shared experiences of them all. The Egyptian farmer, the Roman laborer, the Greek traveler, the Mesopotamian priest, the household servant, the child lying beside a parent, the wealthy person reclining after a long dinner, and the person living in a small village whose name has completely disappeared from history, all eventually reached the same physical limit. The body became tired, the eyes became heavy, the noise of the day became quieter, and eventually the person could continue resisting sleep for only so long before the ancient world, like our own, demanded surrender. What changed was everything surrounding that surrender. For the ancient person, darkness was unavoidable. There was no way to illuminate an entire city with a switch. A lamp could create only a small island of light. A hearth could keep a household warm, but it could not defeat the night beyond the walls. The darkness remained visible at the edges of the room, and that made the transition into sleep something physical as well as psychological. The world literally disappeared around the sleeper. This is why the ancient evening was so strongly built around small acts of reassurance. The lamp said, "There is still light here." The meal said, "The work is finished and the household is together." The story said, "You do not have to remain alone with your own thoughts." The prayer said, "You do not have to protect yourself through every hour of the night." The familiar sleeping place said, "You have been here before." And the presence of other people said that whatever existed beyond these walls, you were not facing it alone. None of these things eliminated danger. They made danger easier to live with. That distinction matters because it is tempting to look backward and imagine that ancient people possessed some secret wisdom that allowed them to sleep peacefully, while modern people have forgotten how. The evidence does not justify such a romantic picture. Ancient people could suffer from terrible insomnia. They experienced nightmares, grief, pain, illness, hunger, fear, and anxiety. A person whose child was sick did not suddenly become peaceful because the evening prayer had been spoken. A farmer worried about a failing harvest could still lie awake. A soldier could carry the memory of violence into his dreams. Someone mourning a dead relative could wake in the darkness and discover that the loss remained exactly where it had been before sleep. The ancient world was not peaceful. The people in it were simply human, and that is precisely why their rituals matter. They were not invented because ancient people had perfect lives. They were invented because life was uncertain, and people needed ways to make uncertainty bearable. The same pattern appears in almost every part of the ancient night. The lamp was small, but it created certainty within its circle. The household prayer might have been brief, but it created a sense of protection. The story might have been old and familiar, but that familiarity gave the mind somewhere safe to rest. The meal might have been simple, but eating together reminded people that the day's struggle had ended. The sleeping object might have been hard, but if it was familiar and protective, it could still provide comfort. The darkness could not be removed, so people learned how to live inside it. And perhaps that is something modern life has made difficult for us to understand. We have spent centuries becoming better at controlling our environment. We can heat a room in winter and cool it in summer. We can illuminate a building at midnight. We can travel after sunset. We can communicate instantly with someone thousands of miles away. We can fill silence with music, conversation, entertainment, information, and endless streams of images. The ancient person had almost none of these abilities. That progress is real. It has saved lives, increased comfort, expanded knowledge, and made the world safer in countless ways. But every convenience changes something. When darkness stopped controlling the end of the day, the boundary between day and night became less clear. When artificial light became cheap and abundant, there was less pressure to stop working or socializing when the sun disappeared. When entertainment became available at any hour, there was less reason to accept the quiet limitations of the night. When clocks became precise, people began measuring sleep more carefully. And when modern life became increasingly connected, the mind gained more opportunities to remain engaged long after the body had become tired. The ancient night had fewer choices. Sometimes fewer choices create their own kind of peace. There was no decision about whether to watch one more episode. There was no endless question of whether another message needed to be answered. There was no glowing screen offering another article, another video, another conversation, another piece of information. Once the lamp went out, the options became very simple: sleep, or remain quietly awake in the darkness. That second possibility brings us back to the mysterious first sleep and second sleep. We should not turn the historical evidence into a universal rule. Not every ancient person necessarily slept in two periods, and the exact extent of the practice remains debated. But the possibility is valuable, because it reminds us that the human relationship with sleep has never been as rigid as modern expectations sometimes suggest. A person could wake in the middle of the night and simply remain awake for a while. They could pray, think, speak quietly, tend the fire, remember a dream, or wait for sleep to return. There was no requirement that every minute of nighttime wakefulness be treated as a failure. The night could contain wakefulness, and sleep could return when the body was ready. That attitude may be one of the quietest lessons the ancient world offers us. We often treat sleep as something that must be achieved perfectly. We measure it, track it, calculate it, and sometimes fear it. A person wakes unexpectedly and immediately begins worrying about the consequences. The mind starts counting the remaining hours, imagining the exhaustion of the next day, and trying desperately to force sleep to return. But sleep is difficult to command. It comes more easily when the body believes it is safe. The ancient evening, in its own imperfect way, was full of signals of safety. The door was closed. The fire was controlled. The family was nearby. The familiar ritual had been completed. The light was low. The day's work was finished. Nothing more was expected until morning. And morning was always coming. That may sound obvious, but for ancient people, the return of morning was physically visible in a way it is not for us. There was no artificial brightness gradually making the bedroom lighter before sunrise. There was no alarm clock waiting to declare the beginning of the day. Instead, the world itself changed. First, perhaps, the darkness became slightly less complete. Then, the outlines of distant objects returned. Birds began to move. Animals became active. The air changed. The horizon began to separate itself from the sky. Finally, light appeared. For an ancient household, this was not simply a change on the clock. It was the return of the world. The road became visible again. The fields returned. The river could be seen. The doorway opened. The fire could be rekindled. The work of another day could begin. And the symbolism of this return was especially powerful in Egypt, where the daily journey of the sun through darkness and back into light was deeply connected with ideas of renewal. The sun disappeared into the west and traveled through darkness before appearing again in the east. human beings, lived inside the same cycle. They worked beneath the sun, surrendered themselves to darkness, passed through sleep, and eventually emerged into another day. The symbolism was powerful because the physical experience was real. Every night contained a small disappearance. Every morning contained a small return. And perhaps that is why the end of an ancient day could feel more complete than ours often does. The modern day can continue indefinitely. Work can follow us home, entertainment can follow us into bed, messages can arrive at any hour, news from another continent can reach us while we are lying beneath the blankets. The world rarely disappears completely. The ancient world did, at least for ordinary people. Once the fire was banked and the lamp was extinguished, the outside world became distant. The night took possession of the landscape. The household withdrew from it. For a few hours, there was nothing to do except wait for morning. And within that waiting, people rested. This does not mean they slept better than we do. We should resist that conclusion. Ancient people faced conditions that could make sleep extremely difficult, and many lacked the safety and comfort that modern people take for granted. The point is not that the past was better. The point is that the past was different. And in that difference, we can sometimes recognize ourselves more clearly. The person who prayed before sleep was trying to quiet the same uncertainty that can trouble a modern mind. The parent singing a lullaby was trying to calm the same restless child. The person lying awake between first and second sleep was experiencing the same strange awareness of being awake when everyone else seemed to be sleeping. The person staring into the darkness and hoping that morning would come was doing something that has never changed, waiting, trusting, and letting go. That is the quiet thread connecting us to the ancient world, not the monuments, not the weapons, not the crowns, the evening. Every person who ever built an empire eventually became tired. Every soldier who marched beneath a banner eventually needed somewhere to sleep. Every king who commanded armies eventually closed his eyes. Every scholar who filled tablets with knowledge eventually put down the stylus. Every farmer who worked beneath the sun eventually returned home. Every child who had been carried through the day eventually fell asleep in someone's arms. History often separates these people by status, culture, language, and time. Night removes many of those differences. When the room becomes dark, the human body remains the same. The heart continues beating. The lungs continue breathing. The mind begins to drift. Eventually, consciousness releases its grip. That is why the history of sleep is so strangely intimate. It takes us away from the grand scale of civilization and places us beside ordinary people at the exact moment when they stopped being workers, rulers, soldiers, priests, merchants, or farmers, and simply became tired human beings. The ancient night was not perfect. It was not peaceful all the time. It was not free from fear. But people learned to build small islands of comfort inside it. A fire, a lamp, a meal, a voice, a prayer, a familiar scent, a protective object, a person sleeping nearby. These things were small compared with the darkness surrounding them, but perhaps they did not need to be large. They only needed to be enough light to see a face, enough warmth to relax the body, enough food to quiet hunger, enough conversation to soften loneliness, enough ritual to tell the mind that the day was finished, enough protection to allow the eyes to close, and eventually enough darkness to sleep. There is something almost beautiful about how little human beings have ultimately needed for this transition. Civilizations have risen and disappeared. Languages have changed. Religions have transformed. Cities have been buried beneath new cities. Technology has moved from stone to bronze, from bronze to iron, from firelight to electricity and beyond. Yet the final movement of the day remains almost unchanged. We stop, we become quiet, we seek comfort, we close our eyes, and we trust that morning will come. Perhaps this is why some of the oldest bedtime rituals still survive. People still tell children stories. People still sing lullabies. People still lower the lights before sleep. People still seek warmth, familiar smells, quiet music, prayer, reflection, or simple conversation at the end of the day. The objects have changed, but the underlying human instinct remains remarkably stable. We are still trying to create a small circle of safety around ourselves before surrendering to the dark. And maybe we have not lost the ancient wisdom entirely. Perhaps the lesson is not that we should return to the past. We cannot, and there would be little reason to. Ancient people would have gladly accepted many of the comforts we consider ordinary. They would have welcomed reliable heating, clean water, modern medicine, safe buildings, electric light, and every technology that made life less dangerous. The lesson is simpler. Comfort does not always require more stimulation. Sometimes it requires less. The ancient evening reminds us that the mind may need a boundary between the world of doing and the world of resting. The body may need a signal that the work is finished. The mind may need permission to stop solving problems. The darkness itself may not be an enemy. A quiet period of wakefulness does not necessarily mean something has gone wrong, and a familiar ritual, repeated without urgency, can sometimes do what endless stimulation cannot. It can tell us that nothing more is required tonight. For the ancient household, that moment came naturally because the environment demanded it. The lamp would eventually run low, the fire would be covered, the doors would be closed, the voices would disappear, the stars would remain above the roof, and the darkness would continue until morning. Let us return there one final time. The evening meal is finished. The bowls have been moved aside. The last conversation has faded. Someone has checked the doorway. Someone has tended the fire. The lamp is burning low. The room is warm enough. The family is together. Perhaps a child has already fallen asleep. Perhaps an old person is quietly repeating the final words of a prayer. Perhaps someone has just remembered a dream from the previous night. Perhaps somewhere near the Nile, a family has carried its sleeping things onto the roof, where the heat of the day has finally released its grip and the stars have appeared above them. Perhaps somewhere else, a Roman household has closed its doors against the night. Perhaps in another place, a small fire has been reduced to glowing embers beneath a covering of ash. The world beyond the house has disappeared. For a little while, there is nothing to conquer, nothing to build, nothing to decide, and nothing to prove. The day is finished, and the people who lived thousands of years ago begin to sleep. One by one, the voices stop. The fire becomes quieter. The lamp grows smaller. The last visible flame trembles once, twice, and then disappears. For a moment, there is complete darkness. And yet the darkness does not last forever. It never does. Far beyond the sleeping household, the eastern horizon is already beginning its slow change. The stars will fade. The sky will lighten. The first sounds of morning will return. The fire will be uncovered, and the small living coal preserved beneath the ash will become a flame again. The door will open. The paths will become visible. The fields will return. The world will begin moving once more. The people who slept through the darkness will wake. They will not know that thousands of years later, someone would think about this ordinary night and wonder what it felt like. They will not know that their small rituals would survive in fragments. The lamp, the headrest, the prayer, the lullaby, the evening meal, the story, the carefully tended fire. They will not know that their lives would become part of a history that would eventually reach people living beneath electric lights, surrounded by machines, screens, clocks, and cities that remain bright long after midnight. To them, this was simply another night, and perhaps that is exactly why it matters. History is not only made of the moments people considered important, it is also made of the moments nobody thought to record. The quiet meal, the tired conversation, the final prayer, the child falling asleep, the fire being covered, the head resting against a familiar object, the eyes closing, the long darkness, and then the light returning. Every human being who has ever lived has known some version of that sequence. We are the inheritors of those evenings. Every night, when we dim a light, leave the day's work behind, lie down, and allow consciousness to loosen its grip, we participate in something unimaginably old. The technologies around us may be new, but the act itself is ancient. The human body has been getting tired at the end of the day for longer than cities have existed. Human beings have been seeking warmth and safety before sleep for longer than writing has existed. Parents have been singing to restless children for longer than anyone can remember. People have been closing their eyes in darkness and trusting that the light will return for longer than history has been recording their names. Perhaps that is the quiet comfort hidden inside the entire story. The ancient people were not fundamentally different from us. They worried, they became tired, they loved people, they feared the darkness, they wanted protection, they wanted their children to be safe, they wanted tomorrow to arrive. And when the day became too heavy, they did what we still do. They let it go. So tonight, somewhere beneath the lights of a modern city, a person may close a door and turn off a lamp. Somewhere else, another person may lie beneath a blanket while rain moves against the window. Someone may finish a book. Someone may say a prayer. Someone may listen to a familiar voice. Someone may wake in the middle of the night and stare into the darkness. And someone, somewhere, may simply close their eyes without knowing exactly when sleep will arrive. The world will continue outside, but for a few hours, the day can finally be over. The ancient lamp is gone now. The fire has become ash. The voices have disappeared. The stars have begun to fade. And beyond the darkness, the first light of morning is already waiting. The light always returns. It returned for the Egyptians beneath their enormous night sky. It returned for the Romans behind their closed doors. It returned for farmers, sailors, mothers, children, soldiers, priests, merchants, craftsmen, kings, and countless ordinary people whose names history never preserved. And it will return for us as well. So perhaps the deepest lesson of the ancient night is not about how they slept, it is about how they stopped, how they accepted that the day could not continue forever, how they created small rituals that allowed the mind to release its worries, how they trusted other people, familiar places, old words, warm fires, and the promise of morning. And perhaps, in a world that rarely becomes completely dark anymore, that is the part worth remembering. The day does not have to be solved before we sleep. Not every problem needs an answer tonight. Not every worry deserves another hour of attention. Sometimes the work is finished simply because the day is finished. Sometimes the most human thing we can do is set everything down. The lamp is out now. The fire glows softly beneath its ash. The house is quiet. The long day is over. The night has come. And for a little while, nothing more is required. Rest well. Morning will come. The light will return, as it always has, and as it always will.